Welcome to Module 1 of the MIDD training curricula. This lecture describes the MIDD landscape for drug development and regulatory science. My name is Jeff Barrett from the Critical Path Institute. I'll be the lecturer for this session. We begin this training series with some background information describing model-informed drug development in general, its context for use in the pharmaceutical industry, and including the support from global regulatory authorities and an ever-expanding stakeholder community. On the next two slides, I list a series of questions that this lecture intends to answer, mainly from the standpoint of providing a framework for model-informed drug development. The investment in MIDD by the pharmaceutical industry was not always obvious. In reality, it's taken 50 years for the approach, not referring to such as the beginning, to be established to the point at which it can be sustained habit practiced by the majority of leading biopharmaceutical companies. In this lecture, we will explore the current practice in the context of several key areas. We'll describe the level of investment, how the approach is integrated within project teams, decision makers, and senior leadership. We'll talk about the budget drivers for MIDD and also describe the buy-in from both the FDA and global regulatory authorities, as well as the synergy created between the industry and regulators. We'll discuss the professional societies that support this content, as well as provide content from a programming standpoint at ongoing meetings, and also incur a lot of networking opportunities for this community to get together and continue to discuss the evolution of the discipline. And finally, we'll talk about the sustainability, how this discipline continues to be supported and expanded, as well as grown and a key part of the future habit, hopefully, by the pharmaceutical industry and the entire community for that matter. So in starting, what is MIDD? We're referring to the application of a wide range of quantitative models that facilitate decision-making in the context of drug development. Models are not new, of course, but their use and application in this context is something that has evolved over time. We're used to a history of discrete models used for certain and very well-defined purposes. But in an MIDD context and approach, it's really focused on the interconnectedness of these models, how they inform each other, and how the decisions that are made along the way are interconnected, so that decisions made at early stages roll up to influence decisions, as well as the data and landscape for decisions that occur later in drug development context. MIDD has been formally recognized as part of the PDUFA Act, of course, so there's been many regulatory applications of MIDD to address a variety of drug development and regulatory decisions. So you should see there's a history here. There's places to obtain good references where there's a lot of detailed information. The various categories for much of the work done to date have been in the dose optimization field, support for evidence of efficacy, clinical trial design, and informing policy. So a very broad range of application. Beyond the regulatory process as well, many sponsors rely on MIDD to facilitate compound progression. These are part of a lot of the stage gate decisions, so it has become, in fact, a habit within the context of the drug development process. And very early on, you'll see this articulated in the definition of go, no-go criteria that are defined even in the target product profile. So there's clearly an investment by the industry to practically develop drugs in this context and in this manner. An important distinction with the current as opposed to past practices is, again, this interconnectedness of the various models to support drug development activities. In the past, and by past I mean in the prior 20 years, most of the models would have been developed in a siloed fashion, informing a single decision, and perhaps developed by a single group. In particular, if we drill down into some of these areas, the biopharmaceutical context, for instance, many of the formulation developers would have collected data around, say, the stability characteristics of some of the APIs, perhaps including some of the excipients and other ingredients, and looked at in vitro and vivo correlations, developing a single model. But it's only in more recent activities where this type of information rolls into the classic PK/PD, where the extension of the formulation performance can be looked at and evaluated in the context of delivering the appropriate exposures and likewise the appropriate effects. So just illustrating the interconnectedness of two very simple models that actually have been developed for a long time. This has likewise evolved where many of these models are now interconnected, extending both from an early stage as well as a late stage. So understanding the disease biology itself, system pharmacology models, models that describe patient variation, as well as the landscape of trajectories of disease progression are also part of this landscape. Our ability to connect these models has likewise improved with the advent of high-performing computing and more modern data practices where a lot of the data can be connected and integrated in a more reliable and accessible manner. So in this manner of evolving the landscape of models, which grows and expands as compound progression ensues, it also likewise provides an availability to look at key decisions along the drug development process. So these decision points are clearly articulated, for example, such things as developing quantitative screening criteria, the first time in man dosing paradigm, as well as the decisions on what those dosing elements should be, definition of the therapeutic window, how we select dose, the design of phase 2 and phase 3 pivotal trials, and how that all rolls up and appears in the drug monograph. These are all key decision points that occur with or without models. The addition of models allows the sponsor to pressure test the conditions of the experiments that support these decisions, but also evaluate whether or not the attributes of the molecule meet the predefined criteria that could be specified, for instance, in the target product profile. Integrating this whole approach provides likewise a landscape of evaluating whether or not, as the compounds progress, that they're performing as expected, and this gives incentivization to the sponsor to make earlier decisions whether or not to proceed with a compound or heighten the pace in the presence of competition or because of new data that may be generated along the way. The results of the MIDD effort touch many of the documents that a sponsor develops along the way and appear in regulatory submissions. I point this out because you as a reviewer potentially will see some of these documents. Likewise, embedded within those documents may be elements of the models that would include the model descriptions, model validation, and or the results of simulations that study various scenarios that describe perhaps the design constructs, endpoint sensitivity, dosing options, and performance. So this is a way of providing you a resource to take a look at that material that you may see over time just by doing your job that would implicate a modeling strategy and a modeling approach. Throughout all the phases of discovery and development, there are critical questions that a sponsor seeks to ask based on targeted experimentation and investigation. In the past, data from such of these experiments, clinical trials, and investigations were viewed in perhaps a simplistic manner, often as tables and listings of discrete experiments without the ability to interconnect these data sources, but also the ability to necessarily pressure test what would have occurred if perhaps they got less of an exposure or greater exposure or change the conditions of the patients that receive the treatment. Just as an example of the utility of models that are used that could have been used along the way. So when does an MIDD approach begin? Well, at the beginning, of course, early in the drug development effort, really at the stage of drug discovery when a sponsor is busy defining drug targets, even before they generate a single candidate, elements of an MIDD approach are defined. Both target validation and early candidate selection phases often yield opportunities to design better experiments, but also to define criteria that would be useful to illustrate successful performance characteristics of compounds in development. Listed on this slide are common milestones that every drug developer hopes to accommodate during the drug development process. As you see, these milestones are diverse and informed by different data sources and various groups that generate the data and are responsible for the relative decisions around each of these milestones. What is unique with an MIDD approach is that each of these milestones could be indexed and supported with various model types. So at every stage of the game, these milestones could be informed by models, but also it kind of highlights the necessity of co-investment of different groups along the way to contribute to not just the data generation, but also the design of the experiments using perhaps a modeling approach. The pharma investment in this approach has been substantial and continues to increase over the past 2 decades, with investments on internal infrastructure, dedicated full-time employees beyond the traditional functional groups that we talked about in the past have likewise been supported. There have been complementary costs associated with the training of young scientists, as well as the resources and tools required to do the work. Group sizes within a company, of course, vary depending on the number of therapeutic areas supported and the size of the organization in general. Big groups, big pharmaceutical companies can employ 100 or more scientists, equivalent to the size of the FDA pharmacometrics group, in fact. So there's clearly an investment in the approach in a variety of manners, with the expectation that this has in fact become a habit within the industry. The perceived value added by pharma continues to expand and spans all phases of development. This was not always the case, mainly because many of the efforts were siloed, as I mentioned previously, and the integration of the various model assets was not perceived as a benefit. The image on this slide may be somewhat cliched, but it makes the point that the overall goal, the right pathway, the right target, the right dose, the right patient, need to be identified and can be identified in this integrated manner and facilitated and optimized with a model-based approach. As previously mentioned, sequential stage gates track with drug development timelines and require project teams to pause and take stock of the status of development, critically reviewing all of the available data and making recommendations regarding the viability of the candidate to continue to secure funding for the next stage of development. So there's clear milestones articulated by every senior leadership group within the industry, recognizing that if these compounds don't meet the required expectations, that they could be killed in favor of perhaps an early stage candidate or a candidate that they acquire as an alternative. So let's take a look at a few stage gates examples that illustrate how models could have informed them. This is a current example based on a first-time-in-man study conducted by Merck on a small molecule antiviral drug candidate. The sponsor conducted the usual alternating panel rising dose design as depicted in the schematic on the left, as well as a multiple dose PK/PD study on the right. So both of these would roll up into the traditional phase 1 criteria that would inform knowledge around the acceptable dose thresholds, as well as the performance around both the safety and perhaps activity of the molecule in healthy volunteers. So you see, again, this is the traditional landscape. Now, in terms of the results, you might see very basic pharmacokinetic information. So in the figures, you'll see the typical mean plasma concentration showing the proportionality of the exposure in the presence of escalating doses. You'll take a look at different transformations of the data to confirm whether or not the drug is viewed as linear or not, and basic pharmacokinetic metrics that define the parameters within and across dose range. So if you just simplistically look at the table-based and graphical information, you might have some confidence that I get a proportional increase or not of drug exposures by escalating dose, and basic pharmacokinetic parameters that might tell me additional information about how often I can expect to give the drug and whether or not the drug accumulates. So at this stage, the sponsor might ask themselves, does the data suggest that the compound should move forward into phase 2? And at that time, they would take stock on what do you know, what don't you know or need to know. So the reality is, you probably think that the data is reasonable, especially given the risk-benefit based on the intended patient population as an antiretroviral. The safety and pharmacokinetics are probably reasonable in healthy volunteers, but additional information, the safety and PK suitability in patients is unknown. So we don't know what happens in an extrapolated manner, transferring that information generated in healthy volunteers to patients. Now, what I may also know is I might have data from preclinical studies that suggest what the in vitro IC50 or IC90 are, and in that context, we could connect the pharmacokinetics generated in healthy volunteers under the assumption that there is similar performance in patients and then it further inform the results of the single alternating dose and multiple alternating dose design to project exposures in patients for a significant amount of time. A model would definitely help us in this regard. These models have been developed, so what I'm showing you here is a basic structural model, a viral dynamic model that kind of illustrates the connectivity of PK information generated perhaps from the data previously shown here with data obtained from in vitro studies that would connect the basic pharmacokinetics with viral dynamics such that you could project the performance in your patient trial. One important aspect of decision making in general is the interdependencies of data and decisions, including the groups that generate the data and the timing of the data availability. While project teams focus on such interdependencies, this is often with the emphasis on resource and time management and not with respect to decision making or how this information could be available at earlier times in the context of evaluating the performance at any given time, and perhaps in the context of where your competitor is in their process. So it provides an opportunity where models can help explore boundaries and investigate scenarios which further expose these relationships. To do this in a coordinated fashion, as well as to reflect on the hierarchy of decision-making bodies, it's important to really define the sub-processes and the inputs into these decision-making units, as well as the data that underlies the model development. Decisions are often made at multiple levels of an organization at the same time, often by different people. While there may be common analyses and analysis tools, the messaging can be quite different, and in some cases decisions could be taken differently depending on who makes them. So likewise, there can be temporal effects that causes an organization on a project team to re-examine past decisions and to diagnose specific or systematic problems in decision-making, the hindsight effect, as it were. Many organizations commonly look to define report cards for how certain efforts or stages of development perform, regardless if they were perceived to be beneficial from the standpoint of a model-based approach or not. So this pathway here kind of articulates the typical flow of information. Now, the questions that may come out of this could be simply, did I pick the right compound? Did I pick the right dose? Was the proof of concept compelling, for instance? And are there still concerns about drug's effectiveness in the context or wake of an effectiveness trial? So this just illustrates some of the typical hindsight effect that occurs within the context of a drug maker's thought process when they look to evaluate past performance. Again, the issue here is, could a model-based approach have improved this and gotten some of the earlier questions answered in a more compelling manner, such that I wouldn't get to the end of the road here and still ask questions about drug effectiveness? An added decision-making complexity is the multidisciplinary composition of teams that make recommendations, as well as the decision-making community. Quite often there are competing factors at play that influence individual decisions reflective of this diversity. As the figure illustrates, on many occasions the varied input gives perhaps contradictory guidance. For instance, if we're asking a simple question on whether or not to develop a transdermal formulation of a particular drug, the clinical pharmacology input would be geared around the attainment of, say, target exposures and whether or not certain pharmacokinetic characteristics came to bear in terms of the performance of the formulations. The formulator may have questions about the assurance around delivering a particular dose load from a certain mechanism of delivery. Marketings may weigh in on the advantage to competitor over 3 times a day dosing, so there may be additional incentivization based on a particular type of formulation. Clinical operations would simply want to know, we've got to be able to provide these within a certain time window and educate on the utility or the administration process in order to effectively administer the formulation. On the commercial side, again, there'd be concerns potentially because of the cost of the transdermal system. So all of these kind of come together just to give you a concept here that there's multiple point of view and they all weigh in. They don't necessarily have equal weight, but they are certainly voices at the table. The actual process of decision making is typically governed by a sequence or series of data generation, summarization, and recommendation with feedback from decision makers prior to the final decision being undertaken. Each company has their own names and jargon around each of these groups, but the schematic above is generally reflective of the process. So you see you have certain departments that will generate data defining attributes of the molecule, the patient population, the formulation, for instance. Project teams will review the data, assign probabilities, and potentially request additional data to be generated to support recommendations. Eventually, all this information would be collated, and the team itself would make recommendations to working groups. Working groups would review the data, set expectations, and make recommendations to the team. And then the project team would have the opportunity to revise and implement working group guidance prior to actually taking up a decision. So, and you see here the feedback loop is obviously a key part of this. This slide attempts to capture the mind of the decision maker and essentially attempts to give voice to the various factors that influence decision makers. While project teams work hard to make solid and defendable proposals, there are other factors that come into play that influence decision makers. Past decisions made by competitors also weigh in and become part of the process. So it's very complex, and sometimes it's not entirely driven by the data. So this just gives you some of the diversity of varied inputs that come into influence decision making. So we like to articulate as much of this in a model-based approach, but this also illustrates that sometimes the eventual decisions have external components as well. So let's take a look at some past decision-making examples in the context of data typically available to inform the decision and the underlying models that could be available to inform the decision. An early milestone target is the identification of the target, where a sponsor seeks to generate data that confirms the actual drug target in the context of some underlying disease biology. So the source data that could be available would be chemical libraries, potentially generated within the company entirely, or perhaps external libraries where the company has access to either through an agreement or some other financial investment or obligation. They may come from actual patient samples that are generated by the sponsor or acquired through some other means. There could be gene expression profiling data, other in vitro, ex vivo, or in situ assays that are generated. These could all be the data that informs the knowledge around the drug target itself. Now, complementary models would be models that define structure-activity relationships, system pharmacology models, models that describe the natural history or disease progression. That would all be useful to identify whether or not this target is reasonable, it's viable, and there's some financial benefit from generating compounds in that class. Another example would be the time around the first time in man study, and specifically about the doses that would be considered in this initial foray into the human phase testing of a new molecular entity. Obviously, the emphasis is the decision, and the study design is safety of the study participants, typically healthy volunteers. The data available to guide the dosing would include short and long-term toxicology data, basic PK/PD information, either in preclinical studies or perhaps from an in-licensed compound in healthy volunteers from other studies prior to the sponsor getting a hold of the product. There could be formulation data, assay data, would all be the underlying source data. Now, the complementary models that could be useful in this context would be, again, the system pharmacology models that describe disease progression and underlie the exposure target windows, physiologically based pharmacokinetic models that might also tell us information about the involvement of genetic polymorphisms, the potential for drug interactions, or the detailed information about whether or not a compound achieves its exposure target outside of the systemic circulation. They could also be informed by population-based PK/PD analysis, either generated entirely from preclinical data or data obtained from an in-licensing manner. All of these data and models could be available to inform the decision around first-time-in-man dosing, both from a dose recommendation standpoint as well as the design of the trial in general. A final example could be the equivalent stage in pediatrics, often called the First Time in Pediatric Study, or FTIP. At this stage, the decision revolves around not only the initial dose selection, but the extent to which one should rely on the adult data, which has typically preceded the pediatric investigation. Tied to the assessment of the relevance to which the adult data is the extent to which the disease progressions are similar in general. So this, you see the flow of the questions here. How is this question even assessed? How similar is the disease progression? Does it mean anything with respect to dose? Is the adult data relevant for pediatrics? That might give you some preconception around the regimen that would be suitable. What is the nature of the pediatric clinical development that supports the intended indications? The identification of the appropriate studies and study designs. All of this information would have been articulated in the PIP, for instance, as well as documentation that maybe have been part of the adult NDA. The data to support these types of stage gate decisions would be the physiochemical drug properties, pre-formulation studies, either conducted previously in adults or specifically for pediatric populations, in vivo pharmacology and toxicology data, and certainly the adult PK, PD, and possibly clinical data, depending on the timing and the indication. The complementary models that would be available could be the physiologically based pharmacokinetic models, system pharmacology models, population-based PK/PD, and disease progression models and clinical trial simulation. All of these could be available to both inform the design of pediatric trials, but also the guidance around the pediatric disease population in the context of similar or comparison to adult patient populations. It should be clear by now that the project team environment is multidisciplinary and the setting requires each of the members to represent their functional areas as it concerns the completion of the project team deliverables as the compound progresses through developments. Certain groups have historically been responsible for certain decisions, so this kind of gives you a context as figure on the complexity and the team composition. Project team leader background likewise changes through stage of development. Multidisciplinary team composition similarly changes with functional areas, support, and accountability for functional deliverables to the team. So as the project progresses from earlier stage to late stage, you might see substitution from, say, basic pharmacology to clinical pharmacology, and the addition of commercial groups to the project team as well. This slide illustrates the point, highlighting the need for project team to own the MIDD output. Both oral and written communication are critical. One thing we've all witnessed during the pandemic is that there, as a variety of modeling types and output, must be clearly represented and interpreted. It is essential to deliver this to the modeling community as decision makers become invested in the approach, and as that they are required to communicate this to a higher level of management. Functional alignment should facilitate peer review, and modelers will likewise need to have not just excellent quantitative skills, but they also need to be good communicators to convey the information in the context of the underlying assumptions and provide interpretation for the extrapolation possibility to other populations or outside the modeling constraints and the data that was used to generate the model. Teams don't always operate in a vacuum either. Quite often the MIDD efforts of one team are shared across teams within a certain therapeutic area. Some team members will present on several projects with the expressed intent of leveraging their experience and expertise across projects and sometimes entire therapeutic areas. So this kind of illustrates the fact that there is an interconnectivity. Certainly when pharmaceutical companies invest in bringing on skilled practitioners of MIDD, it's with the intention of getting maximal value for their knowledge. So sharing team members across project teams and within, even across therapeutic areas, commonly happens. Now there's oversight provided by various review boards that occurs periodically, but again, it's with the intention of all of these stakeholders being represented to eventually inform the executive committees within each of these companies on key decisions that might actually obligate the sponsor to either halt development or change the pace of development. Obviously, the MIDD approach does not exist without the support of its own efforts. The support comes from many diverse ways, and this slide describes some of the major budget drivers, including personnel costs, outsourcing, and compute resources, including hardware and software and cloud computing costs, for instance. The projected $10 million a year may be an underestimate somewhat, but it just gives you a broad understanding of the contributors and the continued investment from pharmaceutical sponsors to use this as a habit for decision making, but also as transparency for how they got the compound through development. And this is something where, again, there's an expectation that this is shared with regulatory authorities, so they don't do this only for their own purposes. There's an explicit appreciation that this information will be shared with the broader community. Their only concern may be for the timing of the sharing of this information, but typically sponsors invest to this extent with the intention of providing seamless and transparent communication of this, certainly to regulators, potentially with also the entire patient community as well. Given the investments that are in place in many organizations, and many feel that the return on investment warrants this investment, it still requires leadership to embrace the MIDD approach, which many will see as an extension of the learn, confirm paradigm, which was highly referenced and supported by the 2004 critical path documents supported by the FDA. So again, there's a history here. This is not necessarily something new, but the utility and application of MIDD really comes back to the concepts that were clearly articulated in this milestone paper, and it continues to be something that's supported by the entire community of drug developers and regulatory scientists. And as you can see, with the original learn, confirm paradigm, it fundamentally challenged the assumptions regarding the definition of the target, the disease, and the treatment, as well as the definition of underlying patient populations and patient selection. So there was this a priori acknowledgement that we needed to do better, and MIDD is really approached to ensure that we do better, but also the translatability of that across different stage gate decision points. As I mentioned in the introduction, many professional societies support this approach. In addition to networking and collaboration opportunities for the scientists in this space, these societies offer a venue for programming that lets both the casual observer or the expert learn, contribute, or review current efforts and evaluate cutting-edge proposals. Likewise, for the MIDD practitioner, it provides an opportunity to share the research, to gain input on different projects that are in working stages of development, and provide a level of critical review as these projects continue to be explored. A diverse array of academic and private sector contract research organizations and academic centers of excellence also support this effort and help to broaden the community, offering training opportunities as well as outsourcing services. It should also be appreciated that this is a global effort, and partnerships, both old and new, exist across all of these sectors. Regarding the sustainability of MIDD, I share the following quote from a recent MIDD consensus group report. So again, these three elements that were clearly articulated in this proposal: educate decision makers in all organizations via workshops and guidelines, articulate the role of modeling scientists in early strategic planning and look to influence their organizations from an internal perspective, highlight the role of professional bodies and consortia. So it's, again, this was a consensus document that was put together by the diverse stakeholder community. Many of the authors on this are coming from regulatory societies, including the FDA. So these points really illustrate the fact that we need to communicate better, continue to educate. This training course, for instance, is really with the idea of both spreading the information and continuing to educate decision makers. You, as an attendee of this course, are perceived to be an important decision maker within your organization. And it's with that effort of continuing to advance knowledge in this space, but also giving people the comfort that this approach has been well tested. It continues to be highly scrutinized. So you shouldn't feel that those practitioners in this space are resting on their laurels. This continues to be a place where critical review is part of the standard practice. And the ability to present this in different scientific forms and consortium provides really an open landscape for critical review, but also for evaluation and sharing of practices. So just to recap what you've heard during this initial model, I hope you can see that this approach is highly invested on by pharmaceutical sponsors and regulatory authorities. It is supported by many professional societies that offer programming of current activities, evolving technology, and impactful use cases. Many CROs continue to exist and support MIDD through consulting services. Recognize that there is a finite supply of those with the skills to do this. So the necessity of outsourcing is always there. So again, as a reviewer of this type of information, you will come across reports from different communities. Again, I would say this is a place where we have good confidence that the practitioners, regardless of where they reside, are performing these tasks with a high degree of proficiency. MIDD has become ingrained in most companies' drug development paradigms, and the mechanism to facilitate compound progression and improve decision making is enhanced by this approach. There are many compelling examples that exist that illustrate the impact of MIDD. Many of these are collected at regulatory authorities and are part of the whole submission process, but also have been published and are part of the shared community of practice. It should be expected that sponsors continue to submit the output of MIDD activities during the process of communicating with regulators. So you will see this at some point during your career. What's next? I suspect that you will continue to see aspects of the MIDD approach with drill downs of model types and many examples. This is going to be part of the ongoing curriculum that you will see as you continue to take this course. There'll be many high impact examples that illustrate the power of the approach. There will likewise be discussion of failures and missed opportunities, including efforts where the full context of an MIDD effort may not be warranted. So this is not something where I would say you always need the full complement of every model resource at your disposal, and we'll illustrate those points. So to be fair, we'll be critical of the approach and recommend its use in a fit-for-purpose approach. Vignettes and descriptions of behind-the-scenes activities will be articulated as part of the training materials. So in this context, we have contributions from many pharmaceutical sponsors who have taken the time to share these vignettes and provide well-articulated examples, and also talking about what was the thought process behind the scenes as they were doing the work. There will be additional perceptions from both leaders, practitioners, and clinical assessors from various sectors, as well as skeptics that give you a broad context for perception of the approach as well as the utility. So we're not going to spare you any of the criticism from this approach as well. It's important to be critical, and I think any of us involved in this area have been critical at different times and continue to do so. Again, this just gives you some basic references from the material presented in this initial lecture. I would tell you that there are many more from these. I hope you find these useful. And again, as I mentioned in the introduction, please feel free to reach out if you have further questions. Thank you.